Have you ever seen someone everyone underestimated, only to watch them outshine experts with decades of experience? That's what happened to a quiet janitor with a limp, a faded mop, and a past no one bothered to ask about. For 20 years, top Navy engineers struggled with a persistent mechanical failure no one could fix. But one day, the most overlooked man on the base did the impossible and changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. No one ever looked twice at Elias Ward. Every morning he pushed his cleaning cart through the gates of the Southbridge Naval Research Facility with the same quiet expression, nodding at the guards, who barely acknowledged him. His uniform was always clean, his shoes polished, his ID badge worn but secure. Most days, he could be seen sweeping the corridors, changing out trash liners, and wiping fingerprints off doorknobs, an invisible presence among the military elite. His left leg dragged slightly, a sign of an old injury that caused him to move slower than others, and though his right hand trembled faintly when idle, it never once interfered with the way he handled his duties. The engineers, scientists, and officers of Southbridge never thought to speak to him beyond a perfunctory thanks or excuse me. If they joked about him at all, it was behind his back, using nicknames like Shaky Mop or the Ghost. He never reacted, never corrected, never pushed back. He just kept his head down and worked. The Southbridge facility was known for one thing: classified naval propulsion testing. Deep within its concrete walls, teams of highly trained specialists worked day and night on experimental engine systems, including one notorious failure known as the STX 990 core. The STX 990 was supposed to revolutionize energy distribution in naval vessels, offering a compact and clean propulsion alternative. But no matter what they tried, the engineers couldn't stabilize the thermal cycling system. It would overheat, collapse, or worse, detonate the insulation gel with volatile feedback. 20 years, 14 leads, millions in taxpayer funding. And still, it remained a humiliating failure for the Navy. The STX 990 core was relegated to a dusty lab with a yellow caution sticker slapped across its casing and a metal cage around its failing internal loop. Occasionally, new hires were assigned to it, told to take a crack if they dared. No one ever lasted longer than a few weeks before giving up. Elias had been cleaning the facility since just after the STX 990 project had begun. He had been there when the first iteration caught fire. He had seen the evacuation drills when the second build leaked coolant across the lab floors. And he was there the day a colonel ordered the third attempt to be permanently shelved. No one thought he noticed any of it. He wasn't supposed to. But Elias noticed everything. While he cleaned late at night, when the labs were mostly empty and the building's fluorescent hum was the only sound, he would often pause outside Lab C-7, the room where the STX 990 sat untouched. He had memorized the machine's structure, the way wires curved from node to node, the placement of the valves, the exact shape of the rotating chamber. Over the years, he'd heard enough frustrated conversations echoing in the halls to piece together what had gone wrong. He knew the engineers blamed the ceramic heat channels, the inconsistent torque ratios, and faulty magnetic dampers. But in his mind, a different image formed, a pattern of mistakes and overlooked logic, one that came from experience, not theory. They never asked what Elias had done before he became a janitor. No one cared that he had once held a different kind of uniform, or that the tremor in his hand came not from birth but from a moment aboard the USS Harbinger when everything had gone wrong. He didn't speak of the fire, or the explosion, or how he'd pulled 2 crewmates out of a flooded engine bay. He didn't tell them about the commendation that was quietly mailed to him 6 months into his medical discharge, or the engineering scholarship he turned down because of the guilt he couldn't shake. Instead, he found peace in silence, in routines, in the quiet rhythm of making things clean and orderly in a world where so much had gone out of control. That was Elias's truth, until one day, something shifted. It was a Thursday afternoon when the new civilian contractor arrived, a brash, overconfident systems analyst named Darnell Lacey, fresh from MIT and already talking about how he'd solved the Navy's biggest embarrassment in 6 months or less. He walked through the corridors like he owned them, talking loudly on the phone, making remarks about the quote, zoo of burnout fossils he'd been assigned to work with. Within days, he had reopened the STX 990 lab and posted new schematics on the glass walls for everyone to see. He mocked the old solutions, laughed at the notes left behind by his predecessors, and even scrawled, "Failure of vision equals failure of design" on the whiteboard in red marker. Everyone tolerated him because they were desperate for answers. Elias noticed the man never looked down, not once, not at the floors, not at the trash bins, and definitely not at the janitor who worked quietly around him every evening. That night, Elias lingered by Lab C7 longer than usual. Through the glass, he watched Lacey pacing, red-faced and frustrated. The core was humming now, operational enough to test at minimal power, but the temperature readings on the console were already flashing warnings. The same problem, the same unsolved error. As Lacey stormed out of the lab and slammed the door, Elias leaned on his mop and stared through the glass. He tilted his head slightly. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes, usually dulled by routine, held a flicker of something else. Curiosity, confidence, maybe even quiet defiance. Whatever it was, it would be the start of something no one could have predicted. Because soon, the man they called Shaky Mop would do what trained experts, high-paid consultants, and entire research teams had failed to do for 2 decades. And when the truth came out, no one would laugh at him ever again. Elias Ward lived in a weather-beaten duplex on the edge of town, far from the glimmer of anything new or modern. His lawn was always trimmed, though not perfectly, and his porch light flickered every few seconds with a low buzz he had long since tuned out. Inside, the space was spare and quiet. A single recliner faced a modest television that hadn't been turned on in weeks. The walls bore no photos, no medals, no frames with proud declarations of the past. Instead, there were simple signs of ritual: an ironed uniform hanging neatly by the door, a work bag packed the night before, and a handwritten grocery list on the fridge in tidy block letters. Elias kept to a routine with military precision, though no one around him knew why. They just thought he was quiet, odd, maybe a little off, the way people often label those they don't understand. Each morning began the same: 4:45 a.m. alarm, a short prayer in silence, black coffee brewed on the stovetop, and a 15-minute walk to the nearest bus stop. The driver, an older man named Kurt, always gave a small nod as Elias boarded. It was the same route, same seat, same arrival time at Southbridge's side employee gate. Elias always entered before dawn, before the engineers filled the building with noise and motion, and long before anyone bothered to wonder who kept the place spotless. He started with the bathrooms, then moved to the corridors, then to the labs, each cleaned with care, each item returned exactly as found. He moved slowly, his left leg dragging just slightly, the result of muscle damage never quite healed from an explosion no one asked about. His right hand, steady during work but jittery at rest, was often hidden in a pocket or curled around a broom handle to conceal the tremor. No one noticed. Or rather, they noticed, but didn't care. Though many thought of Elias as just a cleaner, he approached his work with the precision of a field technician. He understood systems, fluid flow, airflow, electrical wiring. He recognized the way machines aged, how metal expanded and contracted, how stress fractures formed in unlikely places. He had once designed energy transfer schematics in notebooks under dim bunks while serving on a destroyer. That was long ago, and those notebooks were gone now, likely discarded in a moment of grief or self-punishment. He never spoke of what came before the mop, and no one had ever asked. Not the engineers who mocked him, not the officers who ignored him, not even the HR clerk who processed his application with a raised eyebrow at the quote separation line on his form. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But if anyone had watched closely, if anyone had truly looked at Elias, they might have seen the flicker of calculation behind his eyes when he passed by a failing HVAC unit, or the way he paused, just a beat longer than necessary, when he walked by the mechanical core labs. He was always learning, always observing. While others dismissed him as mentally diminished because of his injury and silence, Elias's mind remained sharp, analytical, always running simulations in his head. That silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was awareness honed by years in dangerous, chaotic environments where attention to detail meant survival. Despite the isolation, Elias wasn't bitter. He had made peace with the fact that people judged what they saw, not what they didn't. At lunch, he ate alone in the janitorial closet, a space most would consider cramped and dingy, but which he had outfitted with quiet comforts. A folding chair with extra cushioning, a small thermos of hot soup, and a stack of battered mechanical journals he'd salvaged from recycle bins over the years. He read them carefully, often scribbling notes in a worn ledger he never showed anyone. Sometimes, when the building was empty late at night, he would retrieve a discarded circuit board or failed component from the trash and study it under the old desk lamp in the supply room, fingers moving gently over each solder point, eyes narrowing as he traced the patterns of failure. The only real connection he maintained was with an elderly man named Howard who ran the tool shop down the street from his home. Howard, a Korean war vet with arthritis and a tendency to ramble, never asked Elias what had happened to his leg or hand. Instead, they talked shop, coil resistance, heat transfer, power coupling strategies, old machines, real engineering, not theory. Sometimes, Elias would purchase components that had no use in cleaning, a pressure gauge, a thermal coupler, an outdated wiring harness, and Howard would raise an eyebrow but never ask. He seemed to understand, in the unspoken way some men do, that Elias was more than the role he had been forced into. At Southbridge, the younger staff had their jokes. They called Elias Half-Speed, Captain Mop, or simply Ghost. He never responded, never showed hurt. But inside, there was a fire, not of pride, but of knowing. Knowing that he had been dismissed unfairly. Knowing that he still carried knowledge and experience others had abandoned too easily. He didn't crave revenge or validation, but he did crave purpose. Quietly, over years, he had been building a private theory about the STX 990 core, what went wrong, and how to fix it. Not out of ambition, but because he couldn't let the puzzle go. Because something inside him still needed to be useful, to solve, to serve. And so he watched, and he waited. While others scoffed or overlooked him, Elias Ward quietly prepared for a moment he didn't even know would come. A moment when the Navy's greatest unsolved problem would finally meet the man who had been underestimated for far too long. The Southbridge Naval Research Facility wasn't what most civilians imagined when they thought of cutting-edge military science. It wasn't sleek or filled with chrome-plated robots or gleaming futuristic labs. Instead, it was a fortress of concrete and function, built more for durability and security than for aesthetics. The compound sat at the edge of town, bordered by thick pine woods on one side and a restricted runway on the other. A single road led in, watched by cameras and armed guards, stationed in booths that smelled faintly of old coffee and shoe polish. The outer buildings had once been part of a World War II munitions depot, and though renovations had been made over the years, the bones of the past were still visible: thick blast doors, iron-grated windows, and long, echoing hallways lined with dull green paint that hadn't been fashionable in decades. Inside, the main research wing stretched 3 stories high, with dozens of corridors connecting specialized labs, offices, storage bays, and control rooms. Everything inside ran on a strict hierarchy. Security clearances dictated where you could go and who you could talk to. Each lab was sectioned off by access cards and biometric locks, and each floor had its own rhythm of activity. The top floor was reserved for high-level meetings and executive oversight, a place where uniformed officers and suit-clad contractors debated funding and deployment strategies. The middle floor housed active research, labs glowing with server lights, cluttered whiteboards scrawled with complex equations, and teams of specialists moving from bench to bench with focused intensity. The bottom floor, though, was quieter and colder. That was where the abandoned projects went. Experiments that had failed, prototypes that couldn't be made to work, and files marked Archive, Do Not, REENGAGE. It was also where Elias spent most of his shift. The janitorial staff at Southbridge was minimal. Only 4 full-time custodians covered the entire facility, and Elias had the graveyard shift, not because he requested it, but because no one else wanted it. He didn't mind. The night brought silence, and in the silence, he could listen. The buzz of the overhead fluorescents, the whir of HVAC systems, the faint hum of still-active machinery all painted a soundscape of a building that never truly slept. While others clocked out and left, Elias moved from one corridor to the next with his mop, his cart, and his quiet presence. He knew every creaky tile, every flickering bulb, every room that smelled off because of a leaky vent or miscalibrated air filter. He knew how often each scientist left behind used gloves or improperly stored cables. He knew which labs never locked their doors at night and which ones double-checked the latch out of fear more than protocol. Lab C-7, where the STX 990 core was housed, sat at the far end of the lowest level, behind 2 sealed doors and a deactivated alert system. It had once been a high-traffic area when the project was still active, with engineers and military tech advisors coming and going at all hours. Now, the only regular visitor was Elias, who mopped its floor weekly, even though no one stepped foot inside. The lab was silent, its console lights dark, save for a blinking red indicator on the side of the core, a reminder that the thermal loop still failed to self-regulate even at baseline energy draw. The machine itself was an imposing structure, nearly the size of a small car, with silver heat fins, insulated coolant pipes, and a diagnostic display screen attached to a swiveling arm. To the untrained eye, it looked impressive, futuristic even, but to Elias, it looked tired, like a once promising idea that had been left to rot. The rest of the facility operated on routine. Every Monday, a truck arrived to deliver components from Navy-approved vendors. Tuesdays were systems audit days. Wednesdays, the cafeteria served something vaguely resembling stir-fry. Thursdays were maintenance inspection runs, and Fridays brought performance briefings, meetings in conference room Delta that Elias was never allowed into but often overheard in fragments as he cleaned nearby halls. It was a world obsessed with order, but that order was often an illusion. Beneath the lab coats and lanyards, tension simmered. Scientists quietly blamed other departments for delays. Officers shifted responsibility when questioned about failures. Everyone wanted results, but no one wanted blame. The social atmosphere reflected the same rigid structure. There were clear lines between the engineers, the military personnel, and the support staff. Technicians sat with technicians. Analysts sat with analysts. The janitorial crew, when they interacted with anyone at all, did so through clipped instructions or brief exchanges. Elias wasn't disliked, per se. He was invisible. People left notes on whiteboards when they wanted something cleaned faster. They filed incident reports if a trash can was too full or a light bulb too dim. They assumed Elias didn't notice. But he noticed everything. There were details no one else caught, like the fact that Lab B12's cooling fan made a sharper pitch when too many servers ran simultaneously. Or that Room A5's electrical grid surged every third Tuesday after lunch because someone always ran both the microwave and the coffee machine at the same time. He observed patterns of failure, noticed which engineers skipped steps in procedures, tracked how many replacement fuses were requested for certain systems, signs of overloading circuits or misjudged wiring needs. Elias understood that everything, whether human or machine, had a rhythm, and when that rhythm went off, it meant something deeper was wrong. The world outside Southbridge wasn't much different. The town of Rockmere had grown up around the facility like ivy clinging to old stone. It was a place of modest diners, aging houses, and storefronts that closed by 8. Veterans lived there, mostly, and a few families tied to defense contracts. The grocery store where Elias shopped was the same one where a young scientist might stop for kombucha after a lab shift, though neither would ever recognize the other. Life outside moved in the same subdued rhythm as inside the base, predictable, quiet, and unconcerned with deeper truths. That suited Elias fine. He didn't crave attention. He didn't want fanfare. What he wanted was precision, understanding, and the quiet dignity of solving what others considered unsolvable. And so, as the building hummed and the projects moved forward, some quickly, others toward the same dead ends, Elias Ward kept watching. He cleaned. He listened. He noticed. He moved through the maze of missed opportunities and abandoned ideas, gathering silent knowledge like a cart pushed through shadowed hallways. And somewhere, deep in the chilled belly of Southbridge, a machine still blinked its red warning light in the dark, waiting for the right mind to finally understand what needed to be done. Darnell Lacey arrived at Southbridge with the swagger of someone who had spent their life being told they were special and believed every word of it. At 31, he was already being referred to as a systems savant by military press releases and science journals alike. His resume glowed with top-tier accolades. MIT graduate at 19, Naval Research Fellowship at 21, and a half-dozen published papers in high-impact journals by 27. He had become something of a golden child in defense technology circles, especially among bureaucrats who loved to toss around his name during funding season. Now, with the STX 990 core deemed too embarrassing to remain buried, Southbridge was told to give it one last shot, and Darnell Lacey was the man they were told could fix it. Whether anyone liked it or not, he made a show of his arrival. His first day, he pulled into the lot in a brand-new graphite Tesla, stepped out wearing a blazer over a graphic tee that read, E=MC, who cares, and immediately began shaking hands with a kind of aggressive confidence that made most people instinctively take a step back. He walked through the facility like he already knew it better than the rest of them, his tablet in one hand, his voice bouncing off the sterile walls as he offered commentary on the structural inefficiencies of nearly every department he passed. Within hours, he'd found his way to Lab C-7, where the STX 990 core had been collecting dust. He stood before it with a self-satisfied grin, like a surgeon sizing up a patient on life support just to imagine the glory of resuscitation. Darnell didn't waste time getting to work or making enemies. He called a general meeting on his third day and publicly dismissed all previous engineering notes as dated, cowardly attempts to solve a quantum issue with Newtonian thinking. He wiped the whiteboard clean in front of a half-dozen senior techs and scrawled equations none of them had seen before, then snapped his fingers at a confused lieutenant and asked for coffee. There was a silence after that moment, a long, thick quiet where everyone in the room recalculated their opinions of him. Some walked out. Others stayed, out of duty or curiosity, or maybe even the faint hope that his arrogance was earned. But among them, there was already a brewing resentment. Darnell didn't just believe he was smarter. He needed everyone else to believe it too. He operated with a kind of blinding intensity. For the first week, he stayed in the lab nearly 20 hours a day, rerouting diagnostic feeds, rewriting code from scratch, and tearing apart key components to rebuild them for the century we actually live in. He brought in his own 3D-printed heat sink designs, modified power cells, and made sweeping claims about initiating, quote, full stabilization within 60 days. The problem was, nothing actually improved. If anything, the core began to deteriorate faster. Thermal feedback warnings appeared more often. A coolant bypass valve melted during a live simulation. One minor overload sent a jolt through the lab's secondary power grid, shutting down half the facility for 6 minutes. Darnell didn't apologize. He dismissed the events as expected turbulence in a bold innovation arc. But behind closed doors, senior staff were already raising eyebrows and preparing internal reports. What made it worse was the way he treated those beneath him. Technicians were regularly berated for asking clarifying questions. Junior engineers were assigned menial tasks and then blamed when they failed to produce results from vague instructions. He had a habit of calling people by nicknames they never chose, like Stretch, Specs, or simply Intern, even if they weren't. His version of leadership was domination. If you couldn't keep up, you were in the way. And in this way, Darnell created a culture of silence. People stopped offering suggestions. Team meetings became one-sided lectures. No one corrected him when he misread a data set or overlooked a wiring discrepancy. Fear had taken root. Fear of being ridiculed, dismissed, or worse, publicly humiliated. Of all the people he ignored, none were as thoroughly invisible to him as Elias Ward. Darnell barely looked up when Elias emptied the bins or mopped around the base of the consoles. He never said thank you, never moved aside when Elias quietly reached for discarded parts, never noticed how Elias sometimes paused at the edge of the lab to glance at the schematics left carelessly on the screen. Darnell once stepped back and nearly collided with Elias's cart, then muttered something about janitors with no depth perception, without even turning around. Elias didn't flinch. He just moved on, as always, silent and unseen. But conflict was brewing. Not in the way most stories explode, in fistfights or screaming matches, but in the slow pressure of unmet expectations. Each day the core grew hotter. Each simulation failed faster. Each confidence-laced email Darnell sent to the higher-ups became harder to defend. The team was unraveling, morale slipping through the cracks. The facility's directors were beginning to ask quiet questions about contingency plans. And in the background, Darnell doubled down, convinced that brute intellectual force could still bend reality into shape. He didn't believe in luck, or legacy, or experience. He believed only in control, and when that control began to slip, he responded the only way he knew how: louder, harsher, more aggressively. What Darnell never saw, what he was too proud to notice, was the quiet force of something deeper moving beneath him. Someone who wasn't part of the chain of command, wasn't burdened by ego, and wasn't chasing headlines. Someone who had lived through the kind of failure Darnell was barreling toward, but had learned from it rather than hidden behind excuses. Someone who had been listening, watching, waiting. The battle at Southbridge wasn't just between a man and a machine. It was between two very different kinds of knowledge, one born from textbooks, theories, and accolades. The other born from heat, pressure, pain, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be measured in degrees or citations. And soon, that battle would reach a turning point neither side could avoid. Every day, the pattern played out like a silent film on loop. Julio would arrive at the base well before sunrise, long before the engineers, officers, and administrators. He would unlock the side maintenance entrance, push his mop bucket across the long corridors, and begin the daily process of cleaning up the remnants of people who never acknowledged his presence. Trash bins full of crumpled blueprints, half-empty coffee cups left precariously close to sensitive equipment, grease-stained rags tossed carelessly on expensive machinery. He cleaned it all without complaint. Each day he entered the same buildings, passed the same people, and endured the same offhand remarks or dismissive glances. Sometimes it was subtle, a rolled eye, a whispered joke shared between interns. Other times it was open mockery. One engineer would occasionally fake a limp when passing Julio in the hallway. earning a chorus of chuckles from his group. Another had taken to calling him Captain Mop under his breath, a nickname that stuck like a sour scent. Julio said nothing. He would simply nod, tighten his grip on the mop handle, and continue his work. There was a rhythm to everything in that naval research facility, a ritualistic repetition that dictated how knowledge was passed, how innovation stalled, and how pride often triumphed over collaboration. Meetings were held like clockwork in the glass conference room, where diagrams and schematics of the propulsion test chamber lined the walls like aging wallpaper. Every week, teams of engineers would present updates on Project Zephyr, the classified propulsion stabilization system meant to modernize naval drone operations. And every week, they arrived at the same conclusion: failure. For over 2 decades, the core issue, the electromagnetic destabilization caused when attempting to operate the chamber above 80% capacity, remained unsolved. It was the facility's quiet shame, an open wound that nobody could cauterize. Millions had been poured into it. Experts from multiple countries had consulted. Generals had been briefed with hollow optimism. Politicians had been given tours of sterile labs with scripted presentations, and every time, the room would fill with forced smiles and nods masking the reality. They had no clue how to fix it. Julio, though no one noticed, was always present during those meetings. Not in the room, of course. But he cleaned that glass conference room religiously. After every session, he memorized the shape of the room, the layout of the dry erase boards, the smudged fingerprints on the LCD screen that mirrored the PowerPoint slides the engineers used. He would often pause during cleaning, lingering just a moment longer in front of the schematics left behind, quietly studying the looping wires, the inconsistent input readings, the scribbled notes that circled variables and pointed to anomalies no one seemed able to control. His eyes followed the paths, like someone tracing scars on familiar skin. At night, when the base was still, he would sit on an overturned bucket in the boiler room with a dog-eared notebook in his lap, sketching what he remembered from the diagrams, adding his own notes, thoughts, even questions. He had no formal training in electromagnetic fields or quantum harmonic oscillation, but he had lived a life where details mattered. In the jungle, an overlooked vine could mean a pitfall. In surgery, 1 millimeter spelled life or death. He'd been forced to learn how to see things others didn't. The base staff had long gotten used to the idea of Julio being invisible. They walked past him as if he were a fixture of the wall, like a fire extinguisher or emergency phone. The only times his presence registered were when something broke or flooded and they needed it cleaned, or when security did their rounds and checked his ID badge out of habit. But for Julio, that invisibility was power. It allowed him to observe without pressure, to notice patterns unnoticed by those too busy trying to impress superiors or outsmart one another. He noticed how every attempt to stabilize the propulsion system relied on the same flawed feedback loop. He saw how the engineers adjusted parameters by fractions of a degree, unwilling to challenge the larger assumptions that underpin the whole system's design. He read post-it notes left behind in frustration and translated the unspoken exhaustion of minds hitting a wall for 2 decades. He also noticed something else, a ritual that spoke volumes. Every Friday, after the engineers submitted their reports, they would disappear early, leaving the offices dark before 4 p.m. Julio would wait until he was sure no one remained, then carefully open the locked waste bin in the design lab. Inside were drafts and prints of every week's experiments, shredded but not destroyed. He would piece them back together like puzzles, taping segments, scanning lines, and retracing the diagrams into his notebook. It wasn't out of defiance. It was out of necessity. The chamber, he believed, could work, not because of anything anyone told him, but because of something he had seen once, something he couldn't forget. Years ago, during his time in rehabilitation after the surgery that took his leg, he had met a veteran physicist recovering from a stroke. They had shared meals and stories in the hospital canteen. That man had once drawn a shape on a napkin and told Julio, "If you can see the flaw in this loop, you can solve 30 years of frustration." Julio remembered that shape. One day he saw it again, in one of the shredded documents he'd taped together. The pattern continued: mockery, silence, cleaning, observation, sketching, studying. Year after year, until the pieces in Julio's notebook began to fit into something more complete than anything the engineers had ever assembled. The rituals of dismissal and repetition had kept others stuck in the same loop. But for Julio, each day was a quiet rebellion. Each pass of his mop was a step closer to something none of them saw coming. It was a Tuesday morning when the routine of the Hargrove Naval Research Facility was disrupted, not by a security breach or technical malfunction, but by the unexpected arrival of a new liaison officer sent from Washington. Her name was Dr. Elise Rowan, a civilian systems analyst and former robotics specialist who had been called in to observe inefficiencies in naval infrastructure and report on areas needing restructuring. She had no idea that her most important finding wouldn't come from a laboratory, but from the janitor's closet tucked behind the East Wing stairwell. Elise was different from the high-ranking officers and engineering staff who moved about the facility with rehearsed pride and bureaucratic decorum. She wore her civilian status like armor, not to protect herself from authority but to remain unaffected by its distortions. With her slate-gray tablet in hand and wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose, she didn't walk through the facility like someone impressed by its size or history. She walked like someone looking for something that didn't want to be seen. In her first few days, she noted anomalies in department reporting, inconsistent equipment test logs, and an unsettling disregard for custodial staff. But it wasn't until she overheard a group of young engineers mocking someone behind the loading dock that her focus shifted. She paused, standing just out of sight, as the engineers sneered about the one-legged mop god, laughing about how he'd once suggested an idea to fix the cooling backlog and was told to go clean up his own mess. Something about the cruelty struck her, not just the content, but the repetition. These weren't isolated insults. This was normalized ridicule, systemic and unchecked. Elise made a note to look into the maintenance roster and find out who this janitor was. When she discovered his name, Orrin Weathers, she couldn't place it in any of the employee commendation lists, project participation logs, or internal forums. It was as if he existed only on the payroll and in the background noise of operations. She decided to introduce herself. On the fourth day, Elise arrived earlier than usual and waited near the custodial storage hallway. She found Orrin already there, adjusting a mop handle and sorting bins of stripped wire and broken fasteners. He didn't look up when she greeted him. She offered her name and extended a hand. He paused, glanced at her hand, and returned to his task. She didn't take offense. In fact, she admired his disregard for ceremony. It was refreshing. She visited him again the next day, and the next. Each time she asked a question, not about his injury or the past, but about the facility. Did he notice the condensation levels near the thermal grid? Had he seen the backup generators behaving erratically? Did he think the left wing's cooling vents released unevenly? Each time he answered without looking at her, his responses precise and unfiltered. On the fifth visit, she asked him something no one else ever had. Why did he stay? He stopped scrubbing a copper coil and turned toward her. Not fully, but enough. Because if he didn't, no one else would. It was the first time she saw his eyes, weathered and sharp. There was history in them, not bitterness. Insight. Elise returned to her desk that afternoon and dug into the classified infrastructure repair proposals from the past decade. She wasn't expecting to find anything authored by him. He wasn't listed as an engineer or consultant, but she was curious. What she found instead was a string of repair requests and handwritten suggestions submitted anonymously or through other staff IDs, all with similar language and oddly effective designs. Most had been dismissed as impractical from a custodial perspective or outside the scope of suggested sources. But Elise recognized patterns. The same kind of adaptive circuitry mapping and modular coolant rerouting that had only recently been reintroduced in naval R&D labs. And all of it predated those labs by at least 7 years. She printed out one of the oldest designs, one that recommended a bypass grid for the unstable power loop that had plagued the East Bay dock since 2009. At the time, it had been dismissed as a custodial misfile. Elise brought the diagram to Orrin that evening, just as he was replacing a vent filter. She didn't ask if it was his. She simply laid it in front of him and waited. He glanced at it, gave a faint shrug, and returned to his filter. That was his answer. Elise began her own quiet investigation. She reviewed project logs, repair archives, even janitorial supply orders, looking for every clue that might tie Orrin to the facility's most persistent anomalies. She noticed that each time a system was on the verge of critical failure, a late-night maintenance entry appeared in the logs, unauthorized, unsigned, but the work was always precise, efficient, and untraceable. And every time, Orrin clocked out 20 minutes later than he was scheduled to. Her admiration turned to awe. This man, who was mocked and ignored by the very people who relied on the systems he secretly kept alive, was the silent backbone of a failing giant. She couldn't understand why he hadn't spoken up or fought back or demanded credit, but she didn't ask. She understood the power of choice. Instead, she asked if he would show her how he rerouted the coolant pump last winter, the one that kept the reactor arm from freezing over and delaying the research calendar by 4 months. He said yes. That night, as he took her through the back tunnels behind the central unit, pointing out tiny adjustments and salvaged parts he'd rigged together, Elise realized something that would change everything. Orrin didn't need recognition. He didn't want a title. He had something far more valuable: knowledge, humility, and the rare ability to fix what others couldn't even understand. And now, finally, someone had witnessed it. Someone who wouldn't stay silent. That morning, as Thomas entered Hangar 6, the scent of freshly spilled motor oil, mixed with the ever-present sting of industrial cleaner, filled his nostrils. The morning crew barely glanced at him as usual, heads buried in greasy hands and mechanical dilemmas. He moved silently along the hangar floor, his limp more pronounced that day from a restless night, gripping his mop handle like a cane. Near the bay doors, the newly arrived Lieutenant Sullivan barked orders at 2 young engineers huddled around the failed propulsion unit. Everyone had heard whispers that Sullivan had been brought in to shake things up, but all he seemed to do was rattle cages and repeat failed theories. In the shadows near the fuel tanks, Thomas watched them try the same diagnostic loop for the 3rd day in a row. They were reading from the same manual he had memorized years ago, page 74, subsection D, pulse calibration error. He'd once seen a tech nearly fry an entire array misapplying that exact protocol. He moved toward the edge of the commotion and bent down to polish a brass control panel that didn't need cleaning, just to listen. It was the same chatter. Blame the software. Blame the actuator delay. Blame the Navy for commissioning faulty schematics 20 years ago. Thomas whispered under his breath the one thing no one ever said aloud. The blueprint itself was wrong. A core structural assumption had been misinterpreted when the new adaptive thrust module was installed back in 2005. He knew that because he was there. Not in this hangar, but in a similar one, before the accident, before the discharge, before the court deemed him permanently unfit for anything beyond janitorial work. The thought lingered as he pulled out his notebook, the same one he always kept in his janitor cart. It was a beat-up thing, stained with cleaner and scribbled edge to edge with sketches and notes. Flipping to the page he had marked months ago, he made a slight revision to a hand-drawn diagram of the pulse core's failback loop. Just a line, a curve, a new angle. Then he closed the book and placed it in the tray beside the mop bucket. That was when Marcus spotted him. Marcus, the young systems tech who occasionally brought Thomas extra rubber gloves when the supply closet ran short, had never joined in the mocking. He was curious in a way that couldn't be hidden. When he saw Thomas sketching, he approached casually, pretended to look for a rag in the janitor cart. Then, eyes flicking toward the notebook, he whispered, "What's that?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He looked at Marcus, then at the engineers fumbling again with a secondary power relay. "An idea," Thomas muttered, one they won't want to hear. Marcus raised an eyebrow. They're out of ideas. Try me. With a quick glance to make sure Sullivan wasn't looking, Thomas opened the notebook and pointed to his revised schematic. He explained it softly, methodically, like someone who had trained others once upon a time. Marcus's eyes widened with every line. Wait, that would bypass the misaligned capacitor bridge completely. You're saying that issue isn't electrical, it's geometric? Thomas nodded. Geometry and resonance. They're chasing ghosts in the wiring when it's the design that's flawed. Marcus stared at the diagram, then at the propulsion core. This could work. Thomas shrugged. Or blow a circuit if done wrong. But it hasn't worked in 20 years because no one's questioned the original assumptions. Marcus didn't hesitate. He tore a page from his own clipboard and jotted down the simplified version of Thomas's theory. I'll run this by Langston in diagnostics. If anyone can sneak it through protocol testing, it's her. And just like that, Thomas returned to mopping the base of the generator, unnoticed again by the rest of the team. But something had shifted. An ember had sparked. Marcus, true to his word, quietly floated the concept to Langston during lunch in the break room. She was skeptical but curious. By evening, the test team had sketched the simulation into the offline model, under the guise of outside-the-box calibration. When it worked in the model, when the pulse finally stabilized for the first time in recorded diagnostics, Langston's disbelief turned to obsession. She reran the sequence 8 times. It passed every loop. When Sullivan caught wind of it, his pride clashed with his intrigue. He demanded to know who authored the redesign. Langston didn't hesitate. The janitor, she said simply. Sullivan laughed, thinking it a joke. Then she handed him the notebook, Thomas's notebook, filled with pages of not just that fix, but others. Optimizations, diagnostics, calculations far beyond casual observation. This guy, Langston said, has been watching us stumble for months and already solved what we couldn't even see. That was the moment everything changed. They summoned Thomas, not with mockery this time, but with an odd, uneasy reverence. He walked into the central office flanked by engineers who only days ago had rolled their eyes at him. Sullivan stood there, notebook in hand, expression unreadable. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Thomas didn't flinch. "Same place you did, just paid more attention." There was no dramatic applause, no sudden medals, but in that room, surrounded by those who once dismissed him, Thomas was no longer a ghost. He was seen. Not as the disabled janitor or the man with a limp, but as a mind sharper than the tools they clung to. And for the first time in 2 decades, someone other than Thomas himself believed in what he could do. It was almost too quiet in the main operations wing the next morning. For the first time in weeks, the clatter of tools, the groaning of old pipes, and the muffled complaints from the engineering wing were absent. Instead, a strange hum of anticipation filled the air, as though something unspoken had shifted beneath the surface. The janitorial closet remained locked, its metal handle cool to the touch. Workers, both junior and senior, walked by it with side glances, wondering if the quiet man inside had somehow pulled off the impossible. Though none dared say it aloud, everyone was waiting for word from the top, especially about the pump system that had been down for over 2 decades. Reports from the night staff had been vague. They'd said something was different. Some had claimed they heard new sounds, ones that hadn't echoed in the halls in years. Whispers circulated that the auxiliary turbines, long thought to be completely inoperable, had begun spinning. Rumors grew legs, and soon everyone from the mess hall crew to the naval engineers themselves were talking about the mysterious hum returning to the building, a subtle vibration in the walls that hadn't existed for years. At exactly 8:07 a.m., the director of facility operations, Alan Keel, stormed into the control room. His eyes were wide and bloodshot from working through the night with a skeleton crew of diagnostics techs. In one hand, he held a thick folder of system printouts. In the other, a portable monitor displaying thermal readings from the core circulation chambers. He slapped the folder down on the steel desk and leaned in toward Lieutenant Brady. The engineers nearby froze in place. "The coolant loop is flowing again," Keel announced, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it louder might break the spell. Brady blinked. "That's not possible," he said instinctively. "We removed the impeller blades from the secondary shaft over a decade ago. There's no active drive. It's physically impossible." Keel's eyes didn't blink. "Then tell me why our sensors are showing coolant velocity at 73% optimal efficiency." Silence fell over the room. One of the junior engineers leaned toward his workstation and tapped a few keys. "Sir," he said, astonished. "The heat signature coming off the auxiliary loop matches a continuous, stable flow. It's not a glitch." Keel didn't say another word. He stood upright, turned toward the corridor, and marched straight down the hall to the janitor's closet. Without knocking, he opened it. What he found inside stunned him. The mop and bucket had been pushed aside. Tools, some old, some custom-modified, lined the shelves like a well-organized lab. Circuit schematics covered the walls. In the center of the room, on a folding table, sat a miniature mock-up of the broken circulation system, complete with hand-carved components built from scrap and resin. And in the far corner, with his back turned, sat Eli, humming quietly to himself while oiling a socket wrench. Keel stared for several seconds before speaking. "You were in the subfloor control shaft last night." Eli didn't look up. "Yes." "You rerouted the coolant chamber intake around the corroded piping." "Yes." "You used the old backup turbine housing and rebuilt it with modified couplings you made yourself." Eli paused and finally turned his head. "I've been watching that system for 6 years. I know it like I know my hands." Keel took a step forward, his tone softening, confusion giving way to something closer to awe. "How did you know it would work?" Eli leaned back slightly. "Because it was never about the design. It was about the assumptions made by the people who designed it. They believed the materials couldn't handle rerouted flow at non-standard pressure. But I knew it could, because I tested it in here, in this little room, again and again for years. They were trying to fix the design on paper. I was living with it, breathing it." By the time Keel returned to the operations wing, the story had already spread. The cooling loop had been restored. The ancient system was not only functional, it was outperforming predictions. Maintenance logs were being cross-referenced, and nowhere was there a service entry from the Navy's top engineers that had ever come close to solving it. No ticket had ever been resolved, until now, and it had been a janitor, an amputee with no official engineering credentials, who had succeeded. The entire Dynamics team stood in silence as Keel stepped back into the room. Brady opened his mouth to speak, but Keel raised a hand. "I want every diagnostic report archived, every sensor reading saved, and I want a commendation report drafted in the next 2 hours. A formal one. Because we're going to put Eli Langston's name into this facility's engineering history record. I don't care what department he works for." And with that, the walls of hierarchy that had once separated the broom from the blueprint began to dissolve. Word trickled out to the rest of the base, and eventually up the chain of command. The once dismissed man who had been mocked, avoided, and underestimated had now become a legend in the making. Eli didn't seek attention. He didn't even take the day off. He returned to his routine, mopping, sorting, polishing floors, just as he had done every day for years. But something had changed. This time, as he passed the hallways, people nodded. They moved aside. They didn't see a broken man anymore. They saw the one who had fixed what no one else could. As the conference room doors slammed shut and the hushed murmurs of the stunned engineers trailed off, Silas remained standing at the edge of the platform. The silence that followed was not the cold silence of rejection. It was the vacuum left behind by shattered assumptions and shifting perceptions. For 2 decades, minds equipped with prestigious degrees and countless hours of simulations had tried to solve the facility's aging desalination system with nothing but excuses and increasingly costly upgrades. Yet here stood Silas, the janitor with a limp and a makeshift toolkit, who'd done what all of them couldn't. The engineering lead, Commander Fletcher, who had long held a firm grip on the narrative of Silas being little more than background noise, was uncharacteristically speechless. His gaze flitted from the projector screen showing the perfectly synchronized, efficient metrics of the system's new flow rate to the man still wearing janitor blues with grease-stained sleeves. Fletcher's pride and authority had taken a hit, and though his instinct was to double down, the facts glared back at him with unforgiving clarity. But it wasn't just the metrics. What Silas had done couldn't be reduced to numbers. He had used intuition honed through decades of watching machines, not from a control room, but from down in the trenches. Every day after mopping the corridors, Silas had passed the control panels, the compressors, the humming diagnostics, and learned to read them like a second language. It was in the subtle shifts of vibration, the tone of a pump's whir, the temperature variance in a duct that told him something was off. His senses were his tools, and they had served him better than any expensive software had served the engineers. Now that he had their attention, he didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or bask in the moment. Instead, he did what he had always done. He quietly stepped down, packed away the battered notebook he'd used to record his observations for years, and began rolling up the blueprint he'd drawn by hand. Some of the younger engineers approached him cautiously, with the wary respect given to someone who had just disproven everything they'd believed. One of them, an intern named Lex, who had often chuckled with others behind Silas's back, now asked how he had figured it out. Silas turned, met his eyes, and simply said, "I listened, not just with ears, with everything." That moment became the seed of something bigger. Within days, Naval HQ had been briefed. Word of the janitor who cracked the impossible spread like wildfire. A regional news station picked it up, framing it as a story of quiet genius hidden in plain sight. At first, Silas wanted nothing to do with it. He had lived in the shadows for so long, the light now felt exposing. But then, something unexpected happened. Fletcher, the very man who had once dismissed Silas as a liability, invited him to a closed-door meeting with high-ranking officers and external consultants. Fletcher's pride hadn't disappeared, but it had been punctured just enough to let reality seep in. In that room, as diagrams were displayed and potential applications of Silas's fix were discussed, Fletcher acknowledged, grudgingly but sincerely, that the solution had not only worked, it had done so with elegance. And that word, elegance, meant something in engineering. It implied depth, understanding, and creativity. It couldn't be accidental. A janitor doesn't stumble upon an elegant solution by accident. At that moment, the room looked to Silas not as a fluke, but as a man of insight. The meeting ended with a proposal, not one Silas had expected. They wanted him to consult. Not officially, not with a badge and rank, but as a civilian systems analyst under contract. Silas almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After decades of being ignored, suddenly they wanted his mind on other projects with similar engineering bottlenecks. He didn't accept right away. Instead, he returned to his familiar duties the next morning. The halls looked different now, not physically, but in how people walked past him. Where there were once side eyes and muffled laughter, now there were nods, even hesitant greetings. The cook in the mess hall gave him an extra biscuit without a word. Small gestures, but noticeable. That morning, when he walked past the pump room, he stopped and stared at the new brass nameplate bolted beside the controls. It read, Silas Moore Optimization Protocol, NASH 01. He blinked slowly, ran his fingers over the engraving. No one had told him about it. It was the engineer's way of saying sorry without saying sorry. Later that afternoon, while replacing a light bulb near the upper offices, he overheard 2 mid-level officers discussing a possible recruitment program targeting veterans with mechanical experience. even those without formal engineering degrees. One of them mentioned Silas by name as the case that inspired it. That, more than any article or plaque, meant something. It meant others might never be ignored the way he was. The janitor had become a blueprint, not just for a machine, but for how institutions needed to rethink where brilliance can come from. By the time Silas clocked out that night, the sun had dipped beneath the horizon, casting a long shadow across the lot. But his own shadow, the one cast by years of mockery and invisibility, felt a little lighter. He walked to the bus stop slower than usual, not because of his limp, but because for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a hurry to get away. He wasn't just part of the facility now. He had changed it. The moment the story of Silas's breakthrough reached the ears of the Naval Command and eventually the public, it sparked a wave of interest that rippled far beyond the walls of the Hargrove Naval Research Facility. For years, the facility had been a place known mostly for its classified projects and frustrating setbacks. But now it was the backdrop to an extraordinary tale of perseverance, humility, and unexpected genius. The official press release was carefully crafted by the Navy's Public Affairs Office, highlighting the technical details of the propulsion stabilization system's repair while shining a respectful light on the man behind the solution. Silas Moore, the janitor whose quiet observations and unrelenting dedication had solved a problem that had baffled top engineers for over 20 years, was suddenly thrust into a spotlight he never sought. Yet, he welcomed it, not for fame or accolades, but because finally, the truth of his story was being told in full, without distortion or dismissal. As the news spread, national media outlets clamored for interviews, but Silas remained selective. He chose to share his story not through flashy television spots or staged press conferences, but in quiet conversations and thoughtful writings. In a feature published by a leading scientific magazine, Silas recounted the early years before his accident, his time in rehabilitation, and how his approach to problem-solving evolved through necessity and resilience. He spoke candidly about the isolation he felt, the subtle ways he was dismissed, and how that invisibility paradoxically gave him the freedom to observe and learn without the weight of expectation. The article captured the hearts of readers everywhere, painting a portrait of a man whose intellect and character transcended the physical limitations imposed upon him and the narrow definitions of expertise held by many in the engineering world. The Navy quickly took steps to rectify past oversights. An internal review was launched to acknowledge the countless undocumented contributions that staff members like Silas had made over the years. The review revealed a systemic failure to recognize the potential of personnel working outside traditional roles, especially those with disabilities or unconventional backgrounds. As a result, the Navy introduced new programs aimed at fostering inclusive innovation, encouraging collaboration across departments, and valuing diverse perspectives. Silas was invited to speak at these events, sharing not only his technical insights but also his philosophy on perseverance, humility, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. In the facility itself, the atmosphere transformed dramatically. Colleagues who had once ignored or ridiculed Silas now sought his advice and mentorship. Engineers who had been competitive and territorial opened their minds to his unconventional methods, eager to learn from his unique vantage point. The janitorial staff, often overlooked, felt empowered by Silas's example, recognizing that their work and observations held untapped potential. Silas began leading workshops on problem-solving that emphasized patience, attention to detail, and the value of persistence. His approach was not rooted in textbook theory, but in lived experience, a blend of practical wisdom and an unyielding commitment to improvement. Perhaps the most poignant moment of public vindication came during a formal ceremony held in the Naval Base Auditorium. The commanding officer presented Silas with a commendation for exceptional service, acknowledging his critical role in restoring the propulsion system and improving operational readiness. The room filled with applause as Silas accepted the award with quiet dignity, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief, pride, and gratitude. For the first time, he felt seen, not just as a janitor or a man with a disability, but as a valued contributor to a mission far greater than himself. In the months that followed, Silas's story continued to inspire. Educational institutions invited him to speak to students about overcoming adversity and embracing unconventional paths. Advocacy groups for people with disabilities hailed him as a role model, emphasizing that intelligence and capability cannot be measured by traditional standards alone. His legacy began to take shape not only as a technical savant, but as a catalyst for cultural change within institutions that had long resisted it. Silas himself never lost sight of what mattered most. Despite the accolades and newfound recognition, he remained humble, returning each day to his work with the same dedication that had defined him for years. His commitment to service, to seeing value where others saw none, and to quietly solving problems before they escalated, was the true measure of his character. He understood that his journey was not just about fixing machines, but about challenging assumptions, breaking down barriers, and inspiring others to look beyond appearances. In this full revelation of truth and public vindication, Silas's story became more than a technical achievement. It became a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of inclusivity, and the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be defined by limitations. The legacy he built was not only etched into the very machines he helped repair, but into the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed his quiet revolution. After the public revelation and formal recognition of Silas Moore's groundbreaking contribution, the atmosphere at the Hargrove Naval Research Facility shifted in ways that no one had anticipated. The ripple effect of his achievement extended beyond the technical success of the propulsion stabilization system, transforming relationships, operations, and even the very culture of the facility. The aftermath was a complex mixture of gratitude, reflection, and adjustment, as individuals and the institution grappled with the implications of what had occurred. Among the first changes was a marked improvement in how staff interacted with one another, especially toward those who had previously been marginalized or dismissed. The janitorial staff, once relegated to the periphery of the facility's ecosystem, found their roles re-examined and respected. Rather than being mere support workers, they were now recognized as vital eyes and ears on the ground, capable of contributing unique insights born from their daily routines in the facility's hidden corners. Silas himself became a bridge between departments that had long operated in silos. His humility and quiet confidence made him approachable to everyone, from the highest-ranking officers to the newest recruits. Many engineers sought him out for guidance, eager to tap into the practical wisdom that had eluded them for years. In response, Silas initiated informal mentoring sessions, where he encouraged open dialogue, emphasized the value of persistence, and advocated for the importance of listening to all voices regardless of rank or title. These sessions became a fixture in the facility's culture, fostering a newfound spirit of collaboration and mutual respect. The shifts also extended into administrative policy. Recognizing the flaws in their previous evaluation and promotion systems, the Naval Command launched a comprehensive review aimed at dismantling barriers to inclusion. They instituted new programs designed to identify talent across all job classifications, and to provide training and development opportunities for personnel with diverse backgrounds, including those with disabilities or non-traditional career paths. These initiatives were paired with workshops on unconscious bias and the benefits of inclusive leadership, making the lessons of Silas's story integral to the facility's ongoing evolution. Beyond internal changes, Silas's success spurred innovation in unexpected ways. Inspired by his ability to see beyond conventional wisdom, engineers began revisiting stalled projects with fresh eyes, sometimes inviting custodial and maintenance staff to participate in brainstorming sessions. The resulting ideas, often grounded in practical experience and unencumbered by rigid protocol, led to several breakthroughs in system efficiency and equipment longevity. The base even experimented with cross-disciplinary teams, integrating personnel from various departments to tackle complex challenges collectively. This experiment not only improved problem-solving, but also built camaraderie and a sense of shared purpose. On a personal level, Silas found his relationships with colleagues and supervisors deepening. The previous distance born of skepticism and neglect gave way to genuine friendship and support. Social events, once awkward or avoided by him, became occasions where Silas was welcomed as an honored guest, rather than an invisible presence. Even those who had once mocked him sought reconciliation, some privately admitting the lessons they had learned from his example. The broader community took note as well. Local schools invited Silas to speak about overcoming obstacles and the value of perseverance, and his story became a beacon of hope for those who felt overlooked or underestimated. Disability advocacy groups highlighted his achievements as evidence of the untapped potential in people often sidelined by society's narrow definitions of ability. His name became synonymous with quiet strength and the power of determination. Despite the overwhelming attention, Silas remained grounded. He continued performing his duties with the same care and dedication as before, viewing his role not as a stepping stone to fame, but as a meaningful contribution to the mission. His approach inspired many to reevaluate their own attitudes toward work and the people around them. It reminded everyone that excellence could come from unexpected places, and that humility and persistence were as valuable as formal training. Yet the aftermath also brought challenges. Some longtime staff struggled to adapt to the cultural changes, clinging to old hierarchies and dismissive attitudes. Resistance, though quieter than before, occasionally surfaced in meetings or informal gatherings. Silas handled these moments with patience, choosing to lead by example rather than confrontation. His consistent professionalism and unwavering focus gradually eroded skepticism, fostering a more inclusive environment over time. The facility's leadership recognized that change was a process, not a moment, and committed to ongoing efforts to embed the values Silas embodied into their organizational DNA. In the wake of this transformation, the facility experienced an uptick in morale, productivity, and innovation. Projects that had been languishing for years began to show progress, fueled by the new energy and openness permeating the workforce. The once stagnant propulsion stabilization system, now repaired and optimized, became a symbol of what could be achieved when barriers were broken down and all voices were heard. For Silas, the greatest consequence of this journey was the profound sense of belonging and purpose he had found. No longer relegated to the shadows, he stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of recognizing potential in every individual. His legacy was not only the machines he helped fix, but the people he inspired and the culture he helped transform. The ripple of his quiet revolution continued to spread, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from those who are least expected to find them. The story of Silas Moore's quiet genius transcended the walls of the Hargrove Naval Research Facility and became a beacon of inspiration far beyond its original context. His journey, from being a dismissed janitor with a physical disability to a pivotal figure who solved a 2-decade-old engineering crisis, sparked conversations about talent, inclusion, and the very nature of expertise across industries and communities. As news outlets chronicled his achievements and advocacy groups hailed him as a symbol of perseverance, Silas's legacy took shape not just as a singular triumph, but as a catalyst for broader change. Institutions that had long relied on rigid hierarchies and narrow definitions of capability found themselves challenged to reconsider who they valued and how they nurtured potential. Silas became a living example of the power that lies in overlooked perspectives and the importance of creating environments where all contributions are welcomed and respected. His influence reached educational programs that began incorporating stories like his into their curricula, teaching students about the value of curiosity, humility, and persistence. Universities established scholarships in his name, aimed at supporting students with disabilities pursuing STEM fields, emphasizing the critical role that diversity plays in innovation. Beyond academia, Silas's story encouraged companies in engineering, technology, and beyond to rethink hiring practices and workplace culture. Many organizations initiated mentorship programs and inclusive innovation workshops inspired by his example. They recognized that groundbreaking solutions often emerge from unexpected places, and that cultivating a culture of openness and respect is essential for fostering creativity and progress. At the community level, Silas's impact was equally profound. His talks at schools and community centers resonated deeply, especially among young people who felt marginalized or underestimated. By sharing his experiences candidly, he helped dismantle stereotypes about disability and intelligence, encouraging others to embrace their unique strengths and pursue their passions despite obstacles. Local disability advocacy groups adopted his story as a rallying cry for greater accessibility and opportunity, fueling campaigns to improve workplace inclusion and remove barriers for people with disabilities. Silas himself remained remarkably grounded throughout this surge of recognition. His commitment to humility and service never wavered, and he continued his work at the facility with quiet dedication. But he also embraced his role as a mentor and advocate, using his platform to amplify voices that often went unheard. He collaborated with leaders in education, industry, and government to promote policies and programs aimed at broadening access and nurturing talent. Over time, Silas's story became part of a larger movement that shifted societal attitudes toward disability and capability. It highlighted the danger of underestimating people based on appearance or background, and underscored the necessity of valuing diverse ways of thinking and problem-solving. The lessons he embodied, resilience, observation, patience, and the courage to persist, became guiding principles for those seeking to build more inclusive, innovative communities and workplaces. His legacy was not confined to plaques or awards. It lived in the changed hearts and minds of countless individuals and in the tangible improvements in organizational cultures across sectors. The Hargrove Naval Research Facility itself became a model for inclusive excellence, frequently cited in case studies and leadership conferences as an example of how embracing diverse contributions can lead to remarkable breakthroughs. The propulsion stabilization system, once a symbol of frustration and failure, was now celebrated as a monument to collective possibility, anchored by Silas's vital role. In quiet moments, Silas often reflected on his journey, the years of invisibility, the pain of being underestimated, and the gradual unfolding of recognition. He understood that his story was one thread in a much larger tapestry of human potential and institutional transformation. It was a reminder that true strength lies not only in individual brilliance, but in the willingness of communities to look beyond surface differences and value each person's unique contribution. Ultimately, Silas Moore's legacy was a call to action, to challenge assumptions, to foster environments where every voice can be heard, and to believe that sometimes the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected places. It was a legacy that inspired not only change but hope, lighting the way for future generations to redefine what is possible. Life after the breakthrough was far from static for Silas Moore. While many imagined that solving the decades-old propulsion stabilization issue would bring a sense of finality or peace, Silas found himself propelled into a whirlwind of new challenges and opportunities that tested his resolve and adaptability in ways he had never anticipated. The recognition had opened doors that had long remained shut, but with those doors came responsibilities and expectations that demanded more than just technical skill. They required leadership, vision, and an unwavering commitment to the community that had embraced him. Shortly after his formal commendation, Silas was approached by the facility's Innovation Council with an offer to join their team as a special consultant. The role was unconventional, blending his first-hand practical experience with the opportunity to influence projects at the highest level. While hesitant at first, accustomed to working quietly behind the scenes, Silas recognized that this was a chance to make lasting change and refused to let fear hold him back. He accepted the offer and soon found himself immersed in complex technical discussions alongside engineers and scientists whose education and experience dwarfed his own formal training. Yet, rather than feeling intimidated, Silas brought to the table a perspective shaped by years of observing machines from the ground up, listening to their subtle signals, and understanding their unspoken stories. His input often challenged prevailing assumptions, encouraging teams to rethink problems with fresh eyes. This dynamic not only led to innovative solutions, but fostered a culture of humility and collaboration that bridged gaps between departments and disciplines. Silas also faced the challenge of balancing his new role with the community that had supported him. He remained deeply connected to the janitorial and maintenance staff, who saw in him a beacon of hope and possibility. He continued to advocate for their voices to be heard in decision-making processes, and pushed for resources and training that empowered staff at every level. This advocacy led to the establishment of a peer mentoring program, where experienced staff could share insights and skills with newcomers, strengthening the facility's operational resilience. Outside the facility, Silas's story caught the attention of several philanthropic organizations focused on disability inclusion and STEM education. Invitations to speak at conferences and participate in panels became frequent, offering him a platform to influence broader conversations about accessibility and opportunity. Though public speaking was not something he had ever sought, Silas embraced it as part of his mission to inspire others and break down barriers. However, the increased visibility also brought challenges. Silas encountered skepticism from some quarters. Those who questioned how a janitor could be entrusted with technical decision-making or doubted the authenticity of his achievements. Such doubts were reminders of the deep-seated biases that still permeated institutions and society. But rather than being discouraged, Silas used these moments to reinforce his message that expertise comes in many forms and that true innovation requires openness and respect for diverse experiences. One of the most unexpected opportunities came when Silas was invited to collaborate with a university research team working on adaptive technologies for people with physical disabilities. Drawing from his own experience navigating life with a limp and prosthetic aid, he contributed insights that shaped the design of more intuitive, affordable mobility devices. This collaboration was deeply personal and meaningful, allowing Silas to give back in a way that transcended his previous work. Throughout these new endeavors, Silas never lost sight of the lessons he had learned during his long years in the shadows. Patience, observation, humility, and resilience remained his guiding principles. Each new challenge reinforced the importance of listening to machines, to people, and to oneself. And as Silas continued to break new ground, his story served as a powerful reminder that the journey of transformation is ongoing, filled with unexpected twists and the potential for profound impact in both small moments and grand gestures. Years had passed since Silas Moore first stepped into the shadows of the Hargrove Naval Research Facility, unnoticed and underestimated. Now, as he sat quietly in the modest office allocated to him, a small but meaningful space filled with blueprints, scribbled notes, and photos of the facility's teams, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had unfolded. The room was a testament to transformation, mirroring the one that had taken place not just within the walls of the base but within himself. Silas thought about the years spent moving silently through corridors, the weight of his disability, a constant reminder of limits others imposed upon him. Those limits, once suffocating, had become the very catalysts for his ingenuity. His approach to problem-solving was not born from formal instruction, but from resilience, observation, and a deep empathy for the machines and people around him. This perspective had led to breakthroughs that no textbook or simulation could predict. In those quiet moments, Silas understood that his real victory was not the fixing of an ancient system, but the shifting of paradigms, changing how his colleagues, the institution, and even society viewed ability, worth, and potential. The ripple effects of his work were evident everywhere. The facility had become a place where collaboration thrived, where voices from unexpected places were heard and valued. Junior staff no longer hid their ideas. Managers sought input from diverse teams, and programs that once seemed distant or unattainable became accessible to all. Silas's journey had inspired policies promoting inclusivity, leading to a cultural revolution within the base that emphasized empathy as much as efficiency. He remembered the early days when mockery and doubt were constant companions, the whispered jokes, the sidelong glances, the dismissive comments, each a test of his spirit. Yet, Those experiences had forged in him a quiet strength, teaching patience and perseverance. Silas had learned to listen beyond words, to understand the hidden language of machines and the unspoken fears and hopes of those around him. It was this understanding that had ultimately broken through barriers far greater than faulty machinery. The man who had once been invisible was now a symbol. Yet Silas resisted the trappings of fame and ego. His humility was not just a personal trait, but a deliberate choice, a way to keep grounded and connected to the roots that had shaped him. He continued to work alongside his colleagues, never forgetting the value of every role, every voice. On a deeper level, Silas's transformation reflected a broader societal shift. His story became a mirror, reflecting the need to dismantle outdated assumptions about disability, intelligence, and contribution. It showed that true progress comes when institutions embrace diversity, not as a mandate, but as a source of strength and creativity. The legacy Silas was building extended beyond machines and systems. It was about changing hearts and minds, making room for humanity in all its forms. As he gazed out the window overlooking the sprawling naval base, Silas felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had led to something far greater than personal recognition. It had sparked a transformation that would endure long after he was gone, a testament to the power of resilience, empathy, and the courage to be seen for who you truly are. And in that stillness, Silas Moore smiled softly, knowing that his story was only one thread in the vast tapestry of human potential waiting to be discovered, nurtured, and celebrated. The story of Silas Moore, the janitor who had quietly fixed what top engineers couldn't in 20 years, had become more than a tale of individual triumph. It had evolved into a powerful message that challenged institutions, inspired individuals, and urged society to rethink how it defines talent, worth, and potential. As Silas's journey reached audiences far and wide, it carried a call to action that was both simple and profound, to look beyond appearances, to embrace diversity in all its forms, and to create spaces where everyone's contributions are valued and nurtured. This call resonated deeply in a world too often divided by rigid labels and assumptions. Organizations took note and began reassessing their hiring practices, mentoring programs, and workplace cultures. Many launched initiatives aimed at identifying hidden talents within their ranks and fostering environments where unconventional thinkers could thrive. Educational institutions incorporated Silas's story into curricula, designed to teach resilience, innovation, and empathy, emphasizing that brilliance is not confined to degrees or titles, but often lives in unexpected places. Community groups and advocacy organizations embraced his legacy as a beacon for disability inclusion, using it to fuel campaigns for greater accessibility and opportunity. His experience became a rallying point for those who had been overlooked, encouraging them to persist and believe in their own potential. Silas himself became an advocate not just for technical innovation, but for cultural transformation. He spoke at conferences, engaged with policymakers, and collaborated with leaders across sectors to promote inclusive leadership and equity. Yet, true to his nature, he remained humble, focusing on lifting others rather than seeking personal acclaim. Through mentorship programs and community outreach, he nurtured a new generation of thinkers, creators, and problem solvers who carried forward his spirit of perseverance and open-mindedness. The legacy of his journey was evident in the changes seen across industries: more inclusive hiring, richer collaboration, and a deeper understanding that diversity drives innovation. The barriers that had once confined people like Silas were beginning to crumble, replaced by a culture that recognized the power of difference and the value of every voice. For individuals who had faced exclusion or doubt, Silas's story was a source of hope and empowerment. It reminded them that their unique experiences and perspectives were strengths, that perseverance could rewrite narratives, and that the world needs their talents. His journey encouraged them to pursue their passions boldly and to demand spaces where they could contribute fully. As society continued to evolve, Silas's story stood as a timeless reminder that greatness often emerges from the most unexpected places. It challenged everyone, leaders, educators, colleagues, and communities, to question their assumptions, to be open to learning from all people, and to build environments where innovation and humanity thrive together. In the quiet moments when Silas reflected on the path he had traveled, he understood that the true measure of success was not in accolades or recognition, but in the lasting impact on the lives of others and the culture he helped transform. His story was not just about fixing a machine, but about fixing a mindset, about unlocking potential, and about inspiring change that would endure far beyond his own lifetime. And so, the legacy of Silas Moore lives on, an enduring inspiration to see with new eyes, to listen with open hearts, and to believe in the power of every individual to change the world. This is the story that continues to inspire, challenge, and call all of us to action. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.